a season where God feels absent from your life? Welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk. Right now, you're going to meet Lindsey Jodts, Group Life Pastor at Willow Creek South Barrington campus, share about what it looks like to discover her own expression of faith.
And so what I learned in that season was actually how my posture in all of ministry, which is the most unique thing about you is the most sacred thing about you. There are pieces and particularities about how all of us are wired that sometimes it just takes encouragement or like bravery or sometimes desperation, in my case, to explore that.
Just a note for the listener, Lindsey briefly mentioned self-harm. So if that is triggering or if you have little ears around, I will put timestamps in the show notes. Here's my conversation with Lindsey Jodts. Today, I have my friend Lindsey with me. And Lindsey, you are the group's life pastor at Willow Creek South Barrington campus. Welcome to the Parable Podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Tell me a little bit, Lindsey, about what is your day-to-day? What do you do as a group's life pastor?
So it's all things small groups. I work with a lot of our leaders, pastoring and coaching the small group leaders and creating spaces for people to connect with each other and to meet Jesus. So Rooted is a big part of our strategy. So I am a Rooted facilitator and help work alongside our Rooted pastor. But the ins and outs of my week is kind of planning and creating environments. And then my favorite thing is obviously coaching and working with and discipling and shepherding the leaders, getting to know them and hear their stories, hear about how God is working and how God has gotten them to the place that they are, and just helping them uncover their gifts. Or just most of the time, it's really just me encouraging them and cheering them on and helping just pray for them and lift them up and support them to fully shepherd the people, because that's my job, is to equip the saints for the work of the kingdom. So that's what I do.
Lindsey, when you think back to when you were younger, is this like something, obviously you probably weren't like, let's play groups life pastor after school, but what was your like thing that you're like, this is what I'm going to be when I'm going to grow up?
There's many answers to this story, but I tell people, like, if you knew me most of my life, the fact that I'm a pastor now is kind of God's cosmic joke. Like, I have no business being a pastor. When I was a kid, I either wanted to be an Olympic gymnast because I was a competitive gymnast, or I wanted to be a genetic research chemist. Like, I loved chemistry and I wanted to be like an organic, like do organic biology or organic chemistry and do genetic research. Like, as an 8-year-old, I'm like, I want to do genetic research. And people were like, that is the weirdest human I've ever met in my life. And that is still true. But I'm not a chemist, or I did chemistry at U of I, and I was like, we're good. Like, I'm all set.
It's a little much. Yeah. Chemistry. Wow. Okay. Well, it is humorous when we go back and look at, what are the things that we thought we would be as little kids. Now, looking back too, you said that you like to create spaces for people and cheer them on and coach them. Did you see that within your story?
I think what I see in my story when I look back is definitely I've always liked to create and write, and that's something I do now. It's something I love to do, and that's even my teaching style, is I usually write, like, how would I write this if I was going to share it, like, with others on paper or whatever, and then I craft it into something that's teachable. I don't do the opposite, which is probably, you're a speaker, that's probably counterintuitive, but that's just my process.
Yeah.
And the piece that I see that has always been something that I've done is I love to encourage people. I still write people handwritten notes and cards and letters. I think it's really important to name, and this is what I see in you. And so that's even something, like, I found an old box from high school, and it was like my best friend and I would like pass notes back and forth, in the awesome gel pens that we would pick up at the bookstore. And it was full of like, hey, this is great. How's this going? And hey, I love your face. And, weird weird stuff that high school teenagers say to each other. But just like being able to name and say things that were encouraging and true about people has kind of been something that I've always done. And I didn't realize I did it until I look back on it. I'm like, oh, that is how I've always been. I do love to encourage people, and I do love to just kind of support them and cheer them on.
Who do you think has done that really well for you in your life?
Oh my gosh, there's been different people in different seasons of life. I think the one person that I think of the most when I think of this is, there's a woman in college. Her name is Mindy Meyer, and she was the person that oversaw Greek InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is basically what kept me from probably flying off the planet in college. I was a little bit rowdy, but I still kept one toe in a ministry. I wouldn't go to church. They'd have to drag me to Bible study in our sorority house, but I would go to Greek IV. And so she would meet me for coffee, connect with me, how are you doing? What do you need? How can I support you? I had a really complicated dynamic with finances and family and things like that. And I actually had a dental emergency in college. And I had gotten to know her so well that she, without me asking, actually set up and paid for, or somehow got it paid for, because I never got a bill, me to get my wisdom teeth removed when they were impacted and abscessed. And she was one of those people that I did not give her the grace or the, I was not a willing disciple, if you will. If she did that to me now, I would soak up everything she has to offer, because this woman she's still in ministry. She's brilliant. She's super wise. I love her, but I was not exactly a willing disciple, but she stuck with me and just said, I'm still going to meet with you because I see you not having people that are going to be in your corner. So that was someone who did that really well for me. And it wasn't as much about, I don't really remember that much of what she said, but I remember her being there and being a persistent presence for me at a time when I really needed it. So, and she's part of my faith story. So,
gosh, well, thank you to Mindy. That, you're right. It's sometimes we don't even remember what people said, but it is just being there. And that sometimes is the easiest thing and the most meaningful. So I love that. What do you think is the hardest thing of being a group's life pastor? Groups can be hard. We know we have the humanness, we're all human. So now you bring a group of people together, and that can be challenging. What has been one of those hard things for you, either in your own being grouped together or just being a group's life pastor in general?
I think the hardest thing about being a group's pastor is one of the hardest things that I think a lot of pastors would say, or at least I assume a lot of pastors would say, is that you are shepherding real human people that live in a world that is unkind. And so there are people that are having hard seasons and experiencing kind of the untethering and the undoing of trauma, and they're acting in ways that are sometimes wild or disruptive, and pastoring people that are then shepherding people that are also experiencing the same kinds of things. What's hard is just sitting with people and knowing that there's nothing I can do in a lot of ways to change the dynamic of their lives, and just have to sit with them and say, I see you, and this is hard, and let's walk through this together. And meanwhile, knowing that I'm still going to ask them to do something that is an outpouring of themselves. Obviously, if a leader needs a break and a leader needs to step aside I have tons of grace and fully support and encourage leadership Sabbaths. But a lot of times the leaders are I want to keep going, but I'm really struggling. And so knowing that I'm asking them and encouraging them to do something that they're leading other people while they're going through something it's just challenging and hard how do I navigate this really well and wisely to care for this person and also protect the group and have the discernment of, what vulnerability is going to help the group and what level of vulnerability is actually going to create unhealth in the group and harm the leader in a way that's just not good for them. And so learning how to discern that is challenging, and, it's an imperfect science. So.
One other thing before we jump into your story is, are you helping with youth group?
So I kind of just get dragged into student ministries. So my undergrad degree is in history and education. So I went to school to teach middle and high school, which I never did for a variety of reasons. But when I student taught, I fell in love with middle schoolers. I love them. I think they are the weirdest people on the planet. And that is why they are so amazing. Like, the things they say are so weird. The things they do are so weird. And the things they like are so weird. And it's amazing. And so I love it. And so the student ministry pastors here, my first week of being here, as I was getting to them, I was like, oh my gosh, I love middle schoolers. They're like, noted. And so 2 weeks into being here, I actually helped out, just kind of lead some games at our student half nighter. And then a few months ago, I was one of the onstage MCs for our big half night event or whatever. So yeah, I kind of just get pulled in. The way my work schedule works is it doesn't allow me to actually be a small group leader for middle schoolers or high schoolers, but I am always happy to step in for one-off events and just get goofy with kids. It's fun. It's like playtime, and they are delightful. And when they're in middle school, they still kind of like you. So it's just fun because I still talk to some of my middle schoolers that I led an 8th grade girls group at my previous church. And I still talk to a couple of the girls, either messaging them on Instagram or I actually get coffee with one of them because I just like them as people. And I love having a relationship with these women that I can encourage them and just be another safe adult for them. I don't hold that lightly. And so I'm really honored that they even want to interact with me as they become teenagers. So I love to just get to know them and just find joy in what they're going through, and also solidarity, because I do not miss being a middle school girl.
Oh, I don't miss it either. We have a 13-year-old. We are in the throes of middle school, and she is amazing. But they are weird sometimes, and I'm just trying to understand it. So, but it is fun to just have fun and play. In college, I helped with junior high youth group, and so some of those kids, we still connect with. We go camping with some of those families, and it's awesome. Great. So, gosh, we've turned the corner of how Mindy was a part of your life, and you are imparting that wisdom into other people in different groups. So thank you for sharing that, Lindsey. Obviously stories matter. I think whether you're in a group setting or one-on-one, that's how we grow, how we empathize, and we learn from each other. So, Lindsey, I'd love for you to share a story with us today of how, it is your own parable.
Oh gosh, I've been on quite a journey this life of mine. So I was trying to sort through what story I wanted to share and what I took from it. And I will warn you, before we got on this call, I have been very emotionally tender today. So I don't know how this is going to go. So we're just going to wing it. And I'm an Enneagram 4. So we're just going to go there and we're going to feel it. And I'm not going to we're just
do not apologize for it. I love the emotions as well.
And also, I'd like to offer, just as a caveat, a little bit of a trigger warning for any of your listeners. Part of my story involves self-harm. So I do want to give that trigger warning in case you'd like to offer that to people.
Yes, please.
And for you, just to offer you some preparation before we go. We won't camp there too long, but it is part of the story. So I would say this particular story started in 2019. Well, it really came to a head in 2019. It's a piece of my story that has been ongoing for most of my life, especially as I kind of came into faith and exploring what that looked like and what that meant, and being raised in a church that had very specific confines around this is what an expression of faith looks like, which was, I don't want to shove all of that aside because there are some foundational things that I did gain out of that experience that made me who I am and also gave me some of the foundations for how I express my faith now. But the hard part is there's a lot of confines around things in a lot of evangelical contexts. But in 2019, I was in the middle of grad school and I took a trip to Israel. And it was the most unbelievable experience of my life. Highest highs, lowest lows. If you ever need another time back on this podcast, I can tell you about how at the time I almost died in the desert. And I did write a parable about that, actually.
Wow. Okay.
So like an actual one as a part of my like wrap up paper. But it was the highest highs and lowest lows. It was the first time since I'd had kids that I was away for an extended period of time. I was not responsible for anyone. So I was like there to learn, and like everything was just an adventure. And I sort of came alive on that trip in a way that I hadn't in probably maybe my whole life.
Wow.
And so when I came back from that trip, the denouement of like my entire reality and going from I'm fully alive and fully free to, and I don't want people to get the impression that I don't love my family and I'm not grateful for my family and I don't like having a job and all those things. But the confines around being a full-time working mom, being a female pastor, I'm sure you can resonate with some of that. And I also came back to like my own trauma story that I hadn't unpacked for a lot of the different pieces of my story. So I came back into my life and it really came to a head in a way that brought me into crisis. Like I hit a mental health crisis in that moment that I couldn't navigate through without a lot of help. I actually ended up in a season of self-harm and suicidal ideation to the point where I had to take a 2.5 month leave from work because I was basically given two options by the very wise and very kind doctors. I was already seeing a psychiatrist and a therapist at the time. And they basically said, like, we're going to send you to a hospital or you are going to work with us and we'll create an outpatient program that works directly with us. So I was fortunate enough to have that. But anyway, I ended up taking time off work and really, really struggling. And the thing that I struggled with the most, besides just the like all of the darkness that comes with depression and profound anxiety, is like, where is God in all of this? Like, how can a good God walk me into a season like this and leave me without support, without answers, without a rich, people are always like, oh, just lean into God. Well, my struggle had always been, as long as I've been a believer, and that's why I brought that part up before, is the like, do this and you'll grow and you'll feel connected to God, and do this. And there's always the like, if you do an hour-long quiet time, or you read your Bible this much, or you do this study, or, the kind of the laundry list of go-to spiritual practices that are taught kind of commonly to the public in church, at least in the context that I had been in, didn't really resonate with me. They just didn't work. And so I was like, yeah, it's fine. But like, is there something wrong with me that I can't connect to God in these places and in these things? Like I'm just reading a book to read a book, right? I'm not connecting in any way that feels important. I don't know how to hear from God. I don't know how to listen to God. It feels like I'm just checking a box to check a box. And I never felt any spiritual movement. So alongside all of this like darkness and struggle, I'm also feeling completely absent from God. And so the way it ended up happening is a bunch of different things occurred all at once. So my therapist encouraged me she's like, you need to start moving your body. You are in your head, and your head is right now not your friend. Yeah. So, and also there's so much truth to healing the body and healing trauma through physical experience. I mean, you've read or heard of, at least, The Body Keeps the Score. There's all of this research around how trauma lives in our bodies and how getting and grounding into our bodies is really good for our mental health for a variety of reasons. So she had me start doing yoga. Because I was an athlete, I have a lot of trauma around forced exercise and exercise that doesn't feel good. So she's like, how about yoga? Let's do yoga. So I started doing yoga. And I started going on walks because that felt safe to me. When I go out in nature, I feel lighter and I feel in my body. And I gained a fascination with trees and the way leaves are different shapes in different bushes and different trees. And there's a million different expressions of it, but there's also an order to it. And the wildness of different flowers in the fields and things like that, and how it still just created this beautiful expression of God's goodness and order and and just like the wildness and loveliness of God. And so I started to see that as a way of worship. And then doing yoga and sitting in my body, I found myself being able to, I've never been a person who can just sit still and not think about 100,000 things at once, which is why prayer, like the standard, like follow this model for prayer was always really hard. But after I did yoga, I found myself like I could sit for 20 or 30 minutes and just be quiet and find stillness there. And then I discovered a ministry that actually was out of Willow Creek. It's now its own church. It's called The Practice. And it is a contemplative liturgical worship experience, basically. Like they would gather every week, and they still do. They're, like I said, they have since launched into their own church community. But it was contemporary liturgy and corporate worship in a totally different way. It was embodied. There was lots of call and response. The way they offered communion, they would look people in the eye and say their name and give them the elements. And it was so intense. But it was also really lovely and kind and this creative way of kind of experiencing. And they do lots of contemplation. So I discovered practices like Lectio Divina and things like that. And I started writing. And all of a sudden one day, instead of writing, I wrote a poem. And it like, and I'm like, am I in ninth grade? Like, what is this? And it ended up being a lament that was me able to name this really wounded, trapped part of myself and allow it to interact with God through poetry. And so what I learned in that season was how my posture in all of ministry, which is the most unique thing about you is the most sacred thing about you. There are pieces and particularities about how all of us are wired that sometimes it just takes encouragement or bravery or sometimes desperation, in my case, to explore that. But what I found is there are these ways that I'm wired. Like I love story and I love, like I said, I'm an Enneagram 4. So I am comfortable in the dark spaces. Like lament writing is something that allows me to, like, I feel like I am directly communicating with God when I write. Like I am hearing from and naming back and like it's an interactive experience for me. Whether it's good or not, it doesn't really matter as much as it just is. And so the way I like to encourage people, especially when they're in those seasons where like I can't hear from God, or I don't know how to listen, or I don't know what God wants in this season, or I feel like God is silent, is just to get really creative with like what is stirring in you and allow that to bear its own fruit and not set any expectations around it. Because I always expect like, I'm going to read the Bible and like this one word's going to jump at me and it's like, I'm going to have a sermon. And actually it's like the kindness of Jesus in a Lectio Divina practice, or doing something where I can sit and just be still, or work out all of those things and just kind of creatively explore my own, relationship with God. And so that's the story, is just that the journey God leads us on, sometimes just the getting out of our comfort zone and the desperation of that season really led me to go deeper. And I felt like I found my faith in that season, which you wouldn't think amidst all of that darkness and all of that brokenness and all of the things that I was navigating would be like, there is a glorious wiring on all of us. Like I even ask people that when I'm discipling them, is like, what's glorious about you? And in that question, I mean, what about you is so unique and holy and good that it is the image, that's the Imago Dei. Like that is God in your particularity expressing that's the expression of God in you. And so finding that and helping people discover that and lean into that is the most beautiful thing, when you can help people discover that. And so that's something I've always wanted to do as a pastor. And I hope as I continue to grow as a pastor that I'll get more opportunities to do that, is just help people get creative and discover their particularity and embrace it in all its weirdness and its glory. And it's so. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think so many people walk through this life without recognizing that they are glorious, that they have been given so many gifts and so many quirks and personality traits that there are none to anyone else. Like, they're so specific. And I think that that is so great that you have journeyed through the hard seasons and the amazing seasons and through the desert. And you have found those things about you, and it took some time. So thank you for sharing that. Just a couple questions, because I had a conversation with a couple people the other day of, when we talk about depression, when we're going through hard things in different seasons, was this something that you have struggled with over and over? Or was this, you had this amazing time in Israel and this was just a certain season, and whether God utilized it or like the devil was attacking you through that time, was this like similar instances kept happening over and over, or was this a certain season of your life? That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think for each person, I think you could say some it's one, some it's the other. For me, I have a pretty complicated story, family of origin. I have a history of quite a lot of trauma in my story. And so that I am still like working. I have a wonderful therapist who does internal family system stuff and ART, and I'm just trying to unravel all of that even still. So for me, it was, I think the reality is that I had had chronic depression for a really long time. But I also, because of my story, my survival mechanism is to be fine and to accomplish and to be super high functioning. And I think there's a lot of, especially women that struggle with depression and anxiety, that are super high functioning in their depression and anxiety. And so, and that's not to say men can't be that way, but I know a lot of women that are high functioning and depressed or anxious or both, which it was in my case. And so I think I had been struggling for a really long time. I look back at different seasons where it's been escalated and I've gotten maybe more intense therapy or been on medication for a short season because of that. But I think this was a massive climax of something that had been going on for a really long time that had a catalyst. Like, it's kind of the phrase where you can't enjoy the mountains if you don't experience the valleys. And in my case, it was the opposite, where I experienced this mountain that was like, it wasn't just like a one night retreat, like, yay. It was 16 days of like sacred adventure. And then I came back into my head. I came back into reality. I came back into all of my junk that I had been holding on to and compartmentalizing and justifying and allowing and all of those things. And so it was like whiplash that then catapulted me into this really intense version of something that I think had always been there, or had been there for a long time.
Yeah, there was somebody who was on the podcast a little while ago, kind of just sharing too that trauma is like an onion, or just things that we've experienced in our life where God allows us to be healed to a certain like portion, and then we unravel and there's just like something else that we have to deal with. And for me, just like you, it's like, no, like I thought we were already done with this. I thought we were good. We could check off that box.
I can talk about that without crying. We're fine.
So it's possible, true. Like that Israel trip, it like you were healed in such a way, but like as uncomfortable and as hard as that was, God's like, you know what? I really want you to walk through this. And looking back through it, you said you were angry because like God was absent. Can you help me understand, what did it feel like to have a God absent in your life? I
think it felt totally alone because until I was able to name to my kind of group of friends, this is what I'm going through. Yeah. And I'm fortunate enough to have a group of friends that I was able to say, like, this is where I'm at and this is what's happening and I need you guys to know. And they were able to come alongside me and support me and just be a safe presence of like, hey, there's other people that know what's going on in my life. But up until that moment, which was months down the road of being in just this really dark night of the soul, it's that what almost feels like a Christian platitude to me. I mean, not to everybody, but to me, it's like, but at least I've got God. And it's like, but if God isn't interacting with me, and that's not to say God wasn't interacting with me, but if I'm not able to see it or experience it and there is a biblical precedent of silence from God. And not to say yes or no, that's what was going on. I think I was too wrapped up in everything to even get a chance to experience any way God was interacting with me. But to me, my perception was that God was not there. And so if I am isolated emotionally and mentally, physically, spiritually from my friends and my spouse, and I feel like I can't connect with the human people in my life. And then I'm supposed to like have this God that's always there and loves me to the point where like indwelling happens and I can't, like, I don't even have that. How decrepit must I be? How, like, I felt alone. I felt so worthless and unworthy that it's like, God won't even interact with me. Like, that's not supposed to happen. And so it was really isolating. It was really intense and dark and really scary, but it was real, but it was really lonely.
Well, I'm so glad too that you have a husband and kids and friends who just are supportive of that, because there's so many of us to be like, that would say those platitudes of like, Lindsey, you just need to pray and read John 3:16 6 times. Yeah.
People did. Yeah. And I was like, I don't have time for that. I don't think so. And I think that was part of why I isolated myself, is because a lot of I had people that did know how to just be present with me, but most people didn't, because like it's uncomfortable, right? And if we can't fix it, we don't know what to do with it. That's just how people are. And so there were plenty of people that were like, you just need to like pray this away. And I'm like, I would love if that was the answer. Thank you.
Yeah. And to be honest, and I've said this before too, is just that I was that person like at least 5 to 10 years ago that I would just say like, I don't get it. Like, just pray. But truly, like for somebody who's diabetic, we don't tell them like, just pray the diabetes away. Like that just doesn't how it works. So thank you for sharing that. I think
I will counter that though, Danielle. I don't think you give yourself enough credit. You're actually a part of having been present for me. This is what I'm crying over. Okay. So you're actually part of this, of being present for me, because, and I share this with people, I don't can name names because it's your story to tell, but when I had my ectopic pregnancy. Yeah. And I didn't know how to get through that. Yeah. And I had people that were like, oh, but at least you have this other kid. Or at least you are young enough that you could have another baby. Or like, that just wasn't God's will. And I was like, but that doesn't help. And then you showed up at my house. Gosh. Yeah. And you named your story to me. And you just saying, I know this well. And that was like the first moment in that piece of my story that I wasn't alone. Yeah. And so don't discredit yourself as a platitude giver. We don't do it. Like I walk away from conversations and I'm like, that was probably the dumbest way I could have handled that. That was unhelpful. That was me. That was me reacting to my discomfort and my anxiety. Please stop. Yeah. But just so you know, because I've never named that to you, is like that is a piece of my story that I carry with me when people are going through things that people don't know how to respond to. And unfortunately, I have had a lot of story that I can relate to people in a lot of different hardships and struggles and the complexities and nuances of life. And just to say, like, this isn't about me, but I want to name to you that this is a piece of my story, just so you know you're not alone. And I think not being alone in those seasons is the most helpful thing. And so I never named that to you, but you should know that was something that, I mean, how many years later, like 8 years later, I still like cling to as that is how you live with people and that is how you care for people.
Thank you for sharing that. I think as you go through life, like in some of those things, like not in any way was that mundane, but you're like, how do you help somebody besides bringing them soup or just saying like, it's going to be okay, because it's not always going to be okay.
Sometimes it's just, this sucks and I see you, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Like you just like, sometimes you don't even like think like, oh, this just happened. But actually, I just think it comes back to like what we were talking about with the feelings, like the emotions, like like you think like I've healed, I worked through that.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I just really felt like in that season, like, what did I do that made that happen?
Mm-hmm. And you're the most helpless you could possibly be. I remember sitting in church and feeling like I am broken. My body, it doesn't even do the thing that it's supposed to know how to do on its own. I felt like totally, completely broken, honestly, until you named that in your own story. And I was like, it's not just me. Which is one of those things where it's like, as a person who loves to care for people and tend to them in their wounded places, I wish sometimes it was just me, because I don't want anyone else to experience some of that stuff. But at the same time, it's like, it's also good that it's not just you, because that would be the most isolating version of lived experience. So
so good. All right. Now that our crying portion of the podcast is over, no, it's okay. I have learned to not be ashamed or like apologize for my tears anymore. Like it feels, I love it. So when people say, oh gosh, I'm so sorry I'm crying, I'm like, you just go right ahead.
You do you. How are you doing? Terrible. Thanks for asking. Now let's go.
All right. Let's turn the corner here on like when you were talking about having an expression of faith, because so many people, I think, are like what you said, they walk through seasons of their life thinking, okay, well, if I just do this devotional every morning and I say this prayer and make sure I do that before bed, I'm going to be good. And I just wonder when you said that, like how many people are just walking in this wilderness and not even understanding like the glorious parts of God, because that's what they think that they need to do.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on that. How do I get this into a concise podcast response? So I don't want to diminish that, because I could not practice Lectio Divina. I could not practice lament poetry and writing. I could not practice contemplative practices or appreciate liturgy or any of those things if I didn't have the foundations of like, this is what it's like to read scripture and start to understand it and process it. This is what it's like to pray. You know, some of those foundational basic things. So the hard job is that churches, especially larger churches, are pastoring such a large group of people that because I think there's as many expressions of faith as there is people on this planet. Like God does not have one path to like, this is how you talk to me. This is how you experience me. This is how I talk to you. I think it's unique to each person, but churches can't create every version of that. So they have to do like the basics. But where I think we miss the mark sometimes as people that are pastoring and discipling and shepherding people is to engage the creative imagination of what is good about this, what are you enjoying, and what isn't working. And then if you look at your life and the things in your story, like I would never have been able to, without the help of someone kind of pushing me in that direction, been able to say like, I bet you one of my favorite ways to hear from God is going to be to do yoga and then sit still and silent. But being athletic, being a gymnast was part of my story. So my body has learned to express itself. And that's just part of my creative imagination. It's like using my body to do really cool stuff, right? And so when somebody kind of piqued my creative imagination and said, hey, what are things in your story that make you come alive? Like, where do you come alive? Because I don't think when we come alive in our passions and giftings and experiences and in our story, that's when we can harness a power that is woven into us by God to both communicate with God and communicate God to other people. So when I write poetry, for example, it's a two-way conversation with really pieces of me that don't normally talk. And then if I can share that with somebody and they can say, oh my gosh, like I hear that and I can resonate with that. Now I'm not just communicating with God, I'm also communicating God to somebody else. And our job is to like Jesus said, the church is here, the kingdom of heaven is here. So our job is to partner with God in bringing pieces of the kingdom to the here and now. Like, we're waiting for the someday, right? Great, super.
Yeah.
But like, our job is actually, how do we bring heaven now? How do we bring God into the world to other people? And so I think until you can pique people's creative imagination, it doesn't mean you have to be a creative person. Like, it might be handwriting, copying pieces of like the Bible book by book. I know people that do that, and then they like the way they like see it and resonate with it, like that works for them. I think it's just getting people to like step outside and say, what works for you? What's not working? And like, just because like this checklist doesn't work for you doesn't mean that you don't love Jesus. And it doesn't mean that God is not like, you are not part of like God's chosen people. Like, you are God's beloved. Trust that God has woven something into you that is so sacred that God wants to communicate to and through that. Just trust that, and then get creative and see what happens.
That's so good, Lindsey. I think the creativity, and there's so many ways people can be creative. I think sometimes we just think of it as just an art form, and there is so much more to that. So that is really beneficial, and that is definitely going to be one of our questions. Just like, what are the ways that you could be viewing and experiencing God in such a deeper way besides the three things that you've been doing lately? So thank you for kind of expounding on that. One last question, and it's not a small one. You talked about, just like the confines of being a working mom and to being a female pastor. What is one thing you wish people would know, the challenges of being a working mom or a female pastor? Like, I know there's a lot there, Lindsey, but
oh my gosh, I'm going to say this because I need to believe it more. But I think it's really true of something that is helpful for me and is helpful when I live out of this place is the camaraderie and the power of women who are supporting each other and not saying, well, you parent different from me, so that's bad. Or you hold the title that I want, or you have an opportunity to do this thing or live this life or whatever it is, because female competitiveness isn't making us better. It's holding us back. And I'm a 4, so I live like this setting function is to assume that other people have something that I don't have. Like, my besetting sin is envy, and like, wow, does that resonate with me? So I have to be really keenly aware of when I'm functioning from a place of competitiveness, especially because to keep it from going into a big whole conversation around systemic problems with like patriarchal structure and things like that, which I will happily get into. But we have been set up to compete and not encourage. I think because of the history of how the church has treated women, the history of how American culture has treated women, the world historical culture has treated the context of women in history has not always been kind. So in order for us to survive, we've had to kind of live from a scarcity mindset. And I think the power of being women in ministry especially is we get to name something else that's true about the women and moms in our lives. The daughters and the moms and the mentors and the friends and the co-pastors and the volunteers, we get to name something else that's true about them. And that is that they are fully seen and fully known and fully loved by God, just as everyone else is. And God is not a God of scarcity. There is not just a little bit of goodness. True shalom is when everyone is flourishing and living out their fullest. And so as a woman, as a mom, and as a pastor, I would encourage the women in my circle that I pastor, that I am friends with, and also really myself, to stop competing and stop judging. So I don't say that like, stop judging everybody, because y'all, I do it too. That's why I have to remember it. But just to say, remember that God is not a scarcity God. There is like, God wants us to fully flourish, to be our fullest self as we were created. And when that happens, and if that happens, and if we can tap into even a piece of the fullness of who we were designed to be, we will all be flourishing. Yeah. And you can't do that when you're competing or seeing other people, but especially other women, as threatening. Yeah. Like, you just can't do it. Yeah. So
it was an amazing answer, Lindsey. I think, gosh, it's so good. I mean, there have been women in my life who have brought me to the table or into conversations that I wasn't even in the room for, and in a good way, in a positive way. And I just like look at them and say, gosh, thank you for doing that and for being that example to me. And I just want to continue to do that and fill up other people, encourage them in their gifts. And you're right. God isn't one of a scarcity mindset. So I love that we got all the encouragement back into what we were talking about in the beginning, really. Lindsey, thank you so much for your time today. I know we could continue on for another hour, but if people wanted to connect to you, how can they do that?
So they can follow me on Instagram. That is probably the best way to get a hold of me. It's at Mama Jodts. It's not any fancy pastoral thing. It's just my family mostly being weird. That's what my stories are. So if you're here for like my kids being kids, my messy life, like my random theological ponderings, and then whatever random weird thing I'm excited about, follow me.
Oh gosh. I love it. Lindsey, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Grateful for Lindsey sharing her story today and sharing some of these moments that have made her into the woman that she is today. I'm excited to see how God continues to use her into the lives of so many others. To connect with Lindsey, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Lindsey today. Number 1, what is glorious about you? I know that's sometimes really hard to think about our own self and wonder, like, is she talking to me? Yes, I'm talking to you. What is glorious about you? Because there are so many beautiful things that you are about, that are in your personality, that no one else in the world has but you. Number 2, what is stirring inside you that could come out in a creative way to draw closer to God? I really want you to think outside of the box, because I believe our God really thinks outside of the box. There are so many ways that we can be creative, and not just in an artistic form, but just open up our minds to different ways like Lindsey expressed today, where we can learn and grow and see God in some new, fresh perspectives. One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing it with a friend. If you could pass that along today, that would really help me have people find out about these amazing parable stories. And thank you so much to my technical producer of a husband, Eric, for his top-notch editing skills. That is going to do it for today. I am grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God has provided you with glorious attributes. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.